Last week I did a video discussing the unofficial or soft categories for the types of DPSs in Marvel Rivals, and a lot of you really liked that, which made me happy, and a lot of you said it was very helpful to you, which made me even more happy. One of the main questions I received, of course, was, hey, could you do this for the supports and for the tanks? And today, I'm going to focus on the tanks. What we're going to do is I'm going to discuss the 3 unofficial, or like I said, soft categories for the types of tanks within Marvel Rivals. The goal here is to help you understand what their kit is trying to do in the abstract, as well as giving you an understanding of what they're good against and what they're maybe not so good against. And then we're going to go ahead and break down what each character is in alphabetical order. The first category is the category I call anchor tanks. Some people might call them poke tanks or maybe shield tanks. These are tanks that are entirely focused on staying alive and staying on the battlefield. They have strong, powerful barriers and shields that they can protect their team with. They typically don't have the greatest damage out the gate, like not immediately. It tends to take them a little bit while to get that wound up for them. But to compensate, they tend to have okay range, typically projectiles, or at least something that's like a projectile. And to compensate for this, they don't have the greatest of mobility. And when we were talking about the DPSs, something I didn't get too far into is specific or unique quirks about things like their ults or passives or general abilities, outside of just generally talking about them broadly. But there's not enough tanks, or rather I should say there's few enough tanks that we can actually look into something very specific. And what I'm focusing on here today is their ults. The tank's ults, I believe, follows a pretty clear guidance, a pretty clear outline as to what it is the developers intend for them. In fact, the categories, I feel, follow what their ults are trying to do pretty clearly. So starting with the anchor tanks, they have ults that lock down space immediately. Like, as an example, Magneto is 100% a anchor tank. His whole thing is getting shields up and staying alive, right? And just staying in the center of the field and making it everyone else's problem. Magneto's ult we typically think of as a damage dealer, which it is, but one of its best uses is to shut down damage on the field and lock up that space for your team, allowing you and your team to immediately take control. And I hope that's going to make more sense as we go through more of the categories of the tanks. The next category is brawl tanks. Brawl tanks get their survivability, their sustain, their tankiness through healing and overhealth, the little blue health. They typically have great damage, moderate range, moderate mobility, and ults that focus on damage specifically. Brawl tanks and our last tank category, dive tanks, are both off tanks. These are tanks that don't do the greatest alone. Doesn't mean that you can't make it work, obviously, but if you are alone, typically it's best to have at least some category of anchor in your team, in your DNA of your tank, right? But let's talk about those dive tanks. Dive tanks have burst tanking. These tanking that just kind of comes out of nowhere and can be triggered on or off via an ability or an instant shield or anything of the sort. It's a little bit different than a barrier, which is meant to kind of stay on the field for a long period of time. This is more of stopping a particular source of damage for enough to allow you to move around. They have moderate damage, minimal range, but incredible mobility. Like, the whole point of a dive tank is that they can get in and out of the fight with ease. And their ults all tend to focus on staying alive, something that keeps them alive on the battlefield. A little bit different than some of the other stuff that I've talked about so far. And I think it's going to make more sense as I'm talking about the specific tanks. All right, so starting with alphabetical order here, going through this on alphabetical order, is Captain America. Captain America is through and through your dive tank. Like, he is the classic example. He harasses enemies backline. He has an immediate burst of tanking that he can pop out with his shield. He's impossible to pin down. He's one of the few characters and one of the few tanks that I think make the most sense to actually pick up health packs on his own rather than fully relying on his team for healing, just because he can get from point A to point B so quickly. And of course, his ult allows him to stay alive and keep his team alive at the press of a button. Next up is Doctor Strange. Doctor Strange is pretty thoroughly a anchor tank or a poke tank or a shield tank, whatever you want to call it. I could see an argument being made here that he has some brawl tank DNA in him, maybe an 80-20, but I think that it's too small. I'd like to keep it between 80-20, 50-50, or 20-80, or anything of the sort. So I'm classifying him as a pure anchor tank, but just understand that he's got a little bit of brawl in there, maybe even a little bit of dive, just not enough to make it a full category of him. Next up, Groot. Groot is really interesting because he's got a lot of brawl tank in him, but he also's got a little bit of anchor tank in him too. I could see this going either 50-50, so 50% brawl, 50% anchor, or maybe 80% brawl, 20% anchor. Pick your poison, it's somewhere in there. It's close. This is not going to be an exact science. It's just more understanding the idea, the abstract. Next up is Hulk. Hulk is a perfect mix of dive and brawl. He likes to get in close, stay there for a long period of time, deal decent damage, and then get out. Hulk has an ult that allows him to both do those things, both deal more damage and stay alive for longer. I think he is the perfect representation of both dive and brawl. We've already mentioned Magneto, but just for the people who skipped ahead to this part of the video, Magneto is 100% pure anchor tank. There's not a trace of other things I see on him, frankly. But again, you can let me know in the comments. By the way, if you've gotten this far and you're enjoying this video and you want me to do one of these for the supports, let me know. Subscribe, leave a like, leave a comment. I love reading them. All right, moving on. Penny Parker. Penny is really interesting. She doesn't quite fit into any one category very solidly. In fact, I feel like she could be a category all on her own. However, for the sake of understanding what the categories that we have here, I decided to go ahead and place her in the brawl category, 80%, and anchor category, 20%. Even though she doesn't have a barrier in the traditional sense, her increased range operates kind of similarly, and she's one of the few characters that have regular and easy accesses to stun. She's interesting. I would not be surprised if the thing, which is coming, later in this season, ends up being sort of like Penny Parker, in that we get like a new category starting to grow out of this idea. But for right now, mostly brawl with a little bit of anchor. Next up is Thor. Thor, 100% brawl. This dude is the embodiment of I want to stay in the fight and I want to play DPS, but I don't want to play DPS. I want to look like I'm being a tank. Yeah, Thor is a brawl tank through and through, and Venom is sort of like the Hulk in that he's both a brawl and a dive tank, but more on the dive than the brawl, and not completely full dive either. Venom loves to harass backlines. He loves to get into people's faces and deal big damage before swinging out, but he also likes staying there for a little bit of extra time, more than some of the other dive tanks might. So I could see an argument for him being maybe 80% dive, 20% brawl, or maybe a 50-50, something of the sort. I'm gonna say 80-20 for now. All right, now, what do we do with this information? Well, it helps to understand what the rest of your team is doing. So if you are solo tanking, it's likely best for you to take an anchor tank. Take this with a grain of salt, of course. Obviously, your specific skill sets and what your team is playing and so on and so forth, that's all going to be a massive determinant factor here. But generally speaking, it's good to just have a tank that is just embodying tanking if you've got no one else with you. Now, if you've got other tanks, brawls and dives and such, maybe it's okay to flex around and do some other stuff. Maybe if their backline is being really, really aggressive on you and putting a lot of damage on your squishies, your DPS, your supports and such, that you switch to a solo dive tank, which dive tanks are really good at dealing with enemies deep in the back of the enemy lines, because obviously they have a ton of health and they have the ability to get out if necessary. So dives, great against long-range teams, whereas Brawl is great against close-range teams. And Brawl is also a pretty good option against anchor tanks, as Brawl and their melee-focused damage goes right through enemy barriers, allowing you to continue to get value even if there's a shield in front of you or a shield on an enemy. So something to help you out. Now, another thing I want to talk about here, as I am mostly a DPS player, and all of this has been both informed through, of course, gameplay, but also other Grandmaster or Grandmaster-ish leveled players who have been informing me and helping me make this guide. I want to do a quick little aside and talk about Mr. Fantastic. Mr. Fantastic is technically a DPS, but I would argue he's the closest thing a DPS has to a tank. And if we were to put him in one of the tank categories, he would be a brawl tank through and through, right? Yeah, brawl with maybe the tiniest itty bitty schmeckling of dive, but I would argue fully brawl. He's got that little bit of range, he's got decent damage, he's got big burst tanking with his puffed up chest ability. He is a perfect character for you as a DPS if you're looking to get into tank and you want to get a little bit of practice for you to pick up. If you're looking to get into tanking, if you're trying to get practice with it, start with the brawl tanks as they're the most DPS-like, generally speaking, than the rest of the tanks that are available. And like I said, start with Mr. Fantastic. He is the perfect bridge between these two categories, and it will help you out a lot. It helped me out a lot getting into it, and I found myself to be the most comfortable with the brawl tanks. But let me know what you guys think in the comments. Do you think that these categorizations are correct? Maybe a little bit off? Let me know. Remember to subscribe as it helps us out a lot. Bless your faces and deuces.